I'm so grateful to welcome back two stories from the field. Will and Nevin, welcome back.
Thank you. It's
Thanks, Will.
awesome to be here.
It's good to be back. Thanks for waiting for me to wake up on the West Coast before starting.
And Will about to go to bed because you're joining us in opposite sides of the world. I'm actually in the middle. Will is in Australia, Nevin's in Canada, and yet you have connected and you are good colleagues and friends. And how did this all start? I want to hear, if we were going into your new book, how did you start researching and writing together?
I met after the International Adventure Therapy Conference in Denver, which I believe was 2015. Nevin and I had a mutual friend, Life, L-E-I-V. And Life, I keep this picture next to me because Life unfortunately passed away in 2020. And I keep this picture with me. And Life's one of his last text messages to me, he said, I keep the text message printed on the back. And he said, Will, the world of outdoor therapies has gifted me what I consider two soulmates, Nevin and you. I find it deeply touching that in some ways I bonded with you and had bonded with Nevin. And I keep this one next to me because he goes on to talk about keep doing the work you're doing and keep saying what you think you need to say. And after that conference in 2015-ish, Life messaged me and said, you need to talk to Nevin. And Nevin and I had a video call together. I don't think Zoom was around yet. It would have been like a Skype or something. No. And we had a call and I started reading Nevin's kind of critiques about evidence-based practice and adventure therapy, adventure education. And when I finally talked to Nevin, I said, I think we're reading the same stuff. I think we're reading the same material. I was a early stage PhD student. And I said, we should actually write something together. And we did. And so we've just been writing together ever since. And before we hit record, Will, you asked me, how does it go having a writing partnership with somebody on the other side of the world? And the great news is they don't touch your work while they're asleep. So they do something. And then I wake up and go, there's something new I have to edit and fix. And then I go to sleep and then it's edited and fixed. We published our first article together in 2018, but we've just been writing together ever since. I don't know, Nevin, if you have another version of the story as well.
That's a better story than I was going to tell.
It was touching, really, because this person passed away and he's kind of looking over you and saying, you two should get together. And it's beautiful.
I agree.
How do you recall it, Nevin?
I was working with in Norway for 5 or 6 years, and it was probably in the second year that I think, Will, you had your trip to Norway funded, the research trip. And so, there was this recognition on Life's part that Will and I were on a similar trajectory or had similar ideas and that we should be sharing some more of our time together. And as a working relationship, it is actually really productive. It is nice to write something and go to bed and wake up and see that it's been edited. I guess that's what AI is doing now, but this was an early AI version. But and it's also been really helpful to have someone, I think, who maybe shares a slightly different perspective. So I have a childcare, youth work, then counseling background, whereas Will, social work. I haven't really crossed paths with too many social workers in my research and writing. And so we have these two slightly disparate but similar practices and fields of knowledge that really allow us to look at our work quite broadly. There's an issue. What would the ethics in child and youth care be? What would the ethics in social work be? What would the ethics in counseling and psychotherapy be? We've got these multiple lenses when we look at our work, whereas before I was a canoe guide who became a PhD researcher. Do you know what I mean? It's thickened the narrative around what it is we're looking at and how we're writing about things.
And as people listen to those previous episodes that you've both been on the podcast, Will grew up in the United States, that finished his PhD or did his PhD in Australia and lives in Australia. And Nevin, you grew up in Canada, got your PhD in the United States, and now are back in Canada. So there's certainly some commonalities. You're both white men. You're both are more global citizens and global researchers, because I think John Dewey talked a lot about how land influences our thinking, and you guys have lived in all different sorts of places on the land and on the earth. And I knew Nevin when you were a grad student, so I've known you both for a long time, and you guys have been in outdoor ed, experiential ed, and the Association for Experiential Education. And when this new book came out, I was like, wow, how did they come to write this book? Because it's not like outdoor therapies or other work that you've done, but it's really good. So what was the moment that you both realized, or the decision to take on this journey of writing kids these days?
I think that, oh, do you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
I think it actually goes back to Norway, because we were sitting
That's
at,
what I was going to say. Yeah.
we were back to the International Adventure Therapy Conference that was hosted in Norway in
22, 23.
22 or 23. And
During the COVID years,
Yeah.
you all
The
made
COVID
it
days.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so it was this lovely 2-part conference where we started in the city of Kristiansand and had the first half of the conference. We had a recreation travel day on the route up to Hovden, which is this mountain village. And it's just an amazing place to sit around and to be in a camping conference up in a mountain village. We're having these conversations about, look at all these outdoor therapists hanging out in a mountain village in Norway, social workers, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists. Wow, there's so many people doing this amazing work. And yet the numbers are getting worse. Right. And I don't know, Will, if you remember a book by James Hillman and Michael Ventura, like 25 years ago, 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's getting worse.
Yes.
You look at the numbers and you go, yeah, it's getting worse. And especially for our youth populations, the story is that the rates of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, kids self-harming, suicide, these numbers are going through the roof. We're all trying to do the work that we do. There's more counselors now than ever. Something's gone wrong. That was, to me, I think, that was the genesis of why we started Kids These Days as a book.
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things was we thought we have all these ideas about the outdoor therapies, and that's how the three of us know each other. And at the same time, so do all the cognitive behavioral people, or the EMDR people, or the DBT people, or the ACT people, or the solution focused people. And I thought, Nevin and I, as we were talking, like, how do we actually zoom out from this? How do we actually look at the bigger picture and not, like we read this in the introduction, let's not write a self-serving outdoor therapy book. Let's actually try to keep the public interest as front and center into what we're talking about here. How do we do that? What does that look like? And so that was really the genesis of it. The funny thing, a lot of people have asked us recently about the title, Kids These Days. And the truth is, Nevin, when he said, let's start thinking about this, and I didn't know what the hook was. I didn't see the angle of what we were actually going to say. And Nevin created a Dropbox folder, a shared folder just called Kids These Days. And he started interviewing people. He interviewed Michael Unger. That's probably the most cited recent social work scholar in the world, a resiliency expert. Interviewed Gordon Neufeld. Gordon Neufeld wrote a book with Gabor Mate, Hold On to Your Kids, very popular attachment-based parenting book. And
Right
then,
there on my bookshelf.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then,
He's a legend. He's a legend.
He is a legend. And right then I watched the interviews and I went, oh, we actually know, we have decent enough connections through our work with people who have a story to tell that might help people to zoom out and see the bigger picture of what's going on here. And then we just could not lose the title Kids These Days. It stuck with us. And then it was just an amazing, I don't know, three-year grind of writing it out. It was awesome. I think as far as writing projects, it was the fastest we've written something, and then being scared to death about what did we get wrong for 2.5 years of, okay, let's keep thinking and keep researching and making sure that we're citing everything correctly, not in a boring academic way, but we really wanted the reader equipped with, what can I do with this information? That there's a lot to this.
If I can add, Will, like the 10 interviews that we based the book on, these are individuals that aren't just opinionated. These are people that are well established in their specific disciplines. And also, I think, and whether we did this intentionally or not, they're leading voices in terms of being able to see through the forest and really get to the point. These are the ones that are, I guess, the analogy of getting past the noise to the signal. Some of these folks are also very late career. And I think when we talk to, like interviewing Sue Johnson, emotionally focused therapy, what a spark, like what an absolute catalyst for energy. Like and no holds barred. It's the end of my career. I don't care. This is what needs to happen. Gordon Neufeld, right? Mid to late 70s now. He's absolutely, this is an issue that needs to be addressed. And so really forthright in their ideas, their conviction for change that needs to happen to protect children and youth from bad ideas and bad interventions bolstered our sort of willingness to say and write some of the things that we did. And then we could always go back to those recordings and hear them again and say, yeah, I think Sue would be happy. We know we lost Sue Johnson last year. She passed away. It's like Sue would want us to say it that way. Gordon would want us to be forthright. We sent the draft chapters to each of the each of the interviewees. Gordon Neufeld came back and said, I was pretty bold in some of the things I said. He said that it was almost a little disturbing. And I said, hey, do you want us to rewrite it? He said, no, it needs to be said. Yeah. So this forthrightness it bolstered our sense of we're onto something here. Let's write it. Let's put it down. And then let's make sure that, I might as well talk about this now, that everybody can read it. It's very easy to write to the extremes, to write something that's going to get people on one side of an issue excited and anger the other side. That's controversy. That's being hyperbolic. That's sensationalism. If we wanted to do that, we would have called our book something else, like The Anxious Generation, maybe. But we wanted to make sure, regardless of your position on childcare, your position on therapy, your position, your politics, or where you're from, that we wrote in that middle ground that's messy and requires a bit of work and nuance to understand what issues are really about. When we start going into issues around environmental toxins or gender ideology, those are places that require someone's willingness to actually listen to the research, listen to some experts, listen to some other opinions that may or may not resonate with you and go, yeah, there's something there I took away from it, and not just isolate or push people away from the content. We probably would have sold a lot more books if we did that, but that's not the point.
You're selling books. Come on, it just came out. It's a great title. It's a parenting book. It's for parents, grandparents, people who think about being parents, and it helps not unlike the anxious generation, right? At point like, here's the research, here's the stories, here's our experience. And it's broad enough so it's not just one thing. And I'm wondering, what was the most kind of surprise you or challenge you in writing this book?
Can I say one of the funny, not funny, that's probably the wrong word. One of the most interesting things about this process was, and Nevin and I, an introduction, Will, you've written so much, like an introduction changes when you're done with the whole thing. But one of the things with this book was Nevin and I are very much, we've tried to have we're very concerned about youth voice. Where's the youth voice? You've had me on this podcast before talking about young people there's flies in here, young people who've been transported to wilderness therapy programs. So there's the argument of the adults all say you have to go to this program. And then there's also the youth who have this either saved my life or did not save my life and really hurt me. It's messy. It's a complicated question in some ways. Nevin and I, as you've read our work, we probably don't think transport is all that complicated in many ways. But one of the things I have is it was like flipping youth voice on its head, where what we did was say, what happens when you really talk to the experts about this stuff? What do they really say? And what we found was there's almost no translation of knowledge from what these people are saying into the peer-reviewed world, into the New York Times, into all these other places. And we went, how can we all, as therapists, like giving the context of this conversation, let's put parents aside for a second. How can we all as therapists navigate the headlines, the social media clickbait, all of these things, when the knowledge, the screamers that make us click on things are totally misleading? And it's really confusing. Now, imagine being a parent and you go from the tiger mom to free range kids. Which one is right? They're probably both. It's complicated to navigate. And for parents who inherently just worry about, is my kid sleeping okay tonight? How do they navigate this when they outsource to external expert advice? That to me was one of the hardest parts. And I will say something like social emotional learning. I don't lose sleep about this. I don't spend my days in schools anymore. It was fascinating to listen to Gordon Neufeld and Sue Johnson, who I don't know if they knew each other, but the interviews together were totally aligned. And what they were saying was, we're now teaching emotion instead of giving kids space to feel emotion, to be in their emotion. And that to me, I went, we're going to get in trouble by writing that this is not a good idea. And the research is crystal clear that universally mandating this to all 5-year-olds or 6-year-olds to 10-year-olds, the kids who can just go to school as usual are typically better off. And the kids who get these kind of CBT informed school-based interventions from a younger and younger age are actually more anxious at the end of them. That was like, how does this make sense? That we're overdoing this living on planet mental health.
Planet mental. Oh my God, that's a great line, because the amount of like emotional therapeutic work going on in elementary schools or discussion is going on to such an amount. And it's even though I am part of this system that believes very much in mental health, I'm like, whoa, this maybe has gone a little bit too far. And I think that's part of what resonated from your book. And before we got on, Will, I was talking to you. When I was in graduate school in the 80s, I saw Thomas Szasz talk about the manufacture of mental illness, and he was a psychiatrist saying, whoa, slow down. And early in your book, you referenced that kind of kids these days factor. And like the Who song, the kids are all, but anyways, that there's this generational habit of adults blaming youth for change or decline it. So what sort of patterns that did you notice that makes this effect so persistent? And what's the dangers for those like ourselves who work with young people or who will listen into this podcast.
Go ahead, Ruff.
I think that the danger is, as therapists, we have this conundrum, which is, why do we matter? And I know a lot of us, we want to be trauma-informed, strengths-based, focusing on
Whatever's
people's
the next
resources.
thing, because I mean,
What-
trauma informed, therefore it's
Totally.
bipolar, everything, CBT. I've seen it come and go a lot like that.
Oh, totally. Like, we have suddenly all forgotten about the 90s and early 2000s with genetic predispositions. That's virtually disappeared, right? But so as therapists, though, this thing happens where, and I think this is natural because we want to be useful for the people that we work with. Now, here's the paradox or double-edged sword of this. The only reason we're useful is because of what's wrong with people. That's how we're needed. So we talk about therapy in a way that is, I'm going to kick down the door riding on a white stallion and come in and save the day. And one of the things when we started with this idea of kids these days, this is nothing new. Like Outward Bound and Kurt Hahn talked about the declines of modern youth. So now you need a white stallion to come in and save the declines of modern youth. This has gone on for millennia. But the trouble is today, we have more interventions than ever before. We have more medications than ever before. We have more labels than ever before. Look at the newest one, prolonged grief disorder. Today, while we were recording this, there was an op-ed about why pathologizing grief is necessary. Think about that language. Why pathologizing grief? But why pathologize? It's a human experience. Like grief sucks. We all know that. We've all experienced it. It's brutal. Why pathologize it? At the same time, what Nevin and I are not saying is, if there's something that can help you, take it, do it, do what helps you, do what works. More of what works is helpful. But we can't say that, like, for instance, in psychotherapy, 1977, the first meta-analysis ever, we had about 60 therapies at the time. Today, over 1,000. And the outcomes have only gotten worse. Something is weird here that's happening. It doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. So I think the danger of this whole, there's something wrong with the kids. Nevin brought up the anxious generation. There's also a pill for anxiety. So we could let the kids all keep their phones and just give them a pill. Like, the whole medicalization and pathologizing, which I think is also infantilizing of children, is really problematic to us. The data suggests there's no evidence, if we want to be evidence-based, there's no evidence that this is working, that this story is moving in the right direction. I don't know, Nevin, what do you think?
There's a question about the adults in the room. And Will, I know before you said that this is a parenting book, that was the one thing I think that Will and I tried hard in our writing and hoped that no one would ever say, but ultimately that's what it is.
Thanks.
Because we didn't want to, what's the old saying? We didn't want to shoot on people. We didn't want to tell people. We didn't want 6 rules or 10 prepositions for how to be a parent. But what we thought we wrote was an adulting book. How to be the adult in the room. So every single environment that a child or a youth experiences was created by an adult. We are creating the environments that children and youth are growing up in. If we create an environment in school that allows kids, like Gordon Neufeld would love, to have those big feelings, to have the emotional playground, to actually feel feelings, and a teacher has the ability to sit and be present and maintain some level of safe enough for that child to have those feelings, then growth and development occur. If we have a teacher who has 30 kids and half of them are unregulated, they just have to teach them how to meditate so they can look after their own emotions. Do you see the difference there is that one is an ideal learning and growth environment. The other is us dealing with a modern environment that adults created. So if we look at the mental health, planet mental health, we also have things like, what do adults choose to measure? So we take the DSM, we take the numbers of the DSM. You mentioned Thomas Saz. When he started medical school, there were 6 or 7 psychological disorders. When he finished his career, they were into the hundreds. And Will said, we're up into the hundreds, right? Late 1990s, early 2000s, 2 measures were added to that collection of planet mental health. The general anxiety disorder score, the GAD-7, and the PHQ-9, patient health questionnaire, 9 questions. 9 simple questions, Will. Hey, Will, how'd you sleep last night? If they asked me, I'd say, kind of shitty. I got a head cold. It wasn't a great, so there's a score associated with that answer. 8 more questions, 8 more scores, a total score. I might have mild depression or anxiety. I might have moderate. I might have a high level of anxiety. There's obviously a prescribed dosage associated with each of these. The likelihood of ending up with medication, if you end up going to a doctor and saying, I'm sad, or I don't feel great, or I'm a bit nervous or stressed, the likelihood of getting medication is high. So the bar has been lowered. And so Will and I know that. We also know that could be one of the things that correlates with youth mental health scores that started ramping up in the 2000s. Not just the cell phones, maybe, but also maybe it's what we're measuring and what we're choosing to put a metric beside as the adults determining the outcome. So and then once you start digging into those scales, Will, the rates of false positives, the rates of people that scored no anxiety that still leave with medication. What is it, Will? Was it 65%?
The false positive for the PHQ-9 is 65 to 77%, which is the way that Ned and I have written about this. Is we said that it's like burning toast and your smoke detector going off. It did detect smoke, but there's no fire. So imagine the fire department coming every time your smoke detector comes up. But the more damning finding was there's a study out of the UK, and I believe this is 2011, that of thousands of people given the PHQ-9, those who did test negative for depression, 40-something% still left with a prescription for antidepressants.
And so if you add that to this trend, this ideology of teaching kids more about mental health, introducing the ideas, introducing the concepts, introducing the diagnosis. Will found this book that was like #1 on the charts the first year we were writing. It was Psychiatry for Kids. It was picture. It was a full-on cartoonized picture book teaching children all of these modern diagnoses.
Anorexia. It taught bulimia. We only found it because it was the second best-selling book on Amazon in the psychiatry category besides the DSM. So it was DSM, Psychiatry for Kids. And that was part of a series. There was plastic surgery for kids. It was part of a series about all these ideas. And so one of the things, and like we joke about this throughout the book, like not joking in a ha-ha way, but I remember, like I studied at community college. I remember walking into Psychology 101, and our teacher walked in the room and said, we're going to learn about something like OCD, and all of you are going to think that you have OCD. You do not have OCD. Do not internalize what you're learning from the textbooks. Do not do this. And then we found all of these books that are actually almost encouraging the internalizing of these labels. And go ahead, Will. I'll let you go.
This is so resonating with me. So I've taught an adventure therapy class for like almost 20 years at Plymouth State University here in New Hampshire. Every one of the assignments is create an adventure therapy program for a specific population diagnosis, blah, blah, blah. Did it for 20 years. Last year when I did it, first time this ever happened, 20 students, 18 of them created a program for their diagnosis. They had never,
my God.
that had never happened before. And then all of a sudden, so you're just like, you're triggering me. They're like, I have OCD and I have attachment. And I was like, that's cool. You guys are sharing. And this is very interesting because I've never had this happen before in this class. So it's just like, wow.
You're also speaking to another sort of knock-on effect of spending so much time talking about mental health. This notion, like Will said, to not self-identify with this disorder. Looking at symptomology on WebMD, thinking about what you're seeing on your scroll, which is being curated around the thinking and ideas that you're sharing with others or talking about, leads you to this place where you go, oh, maybe I do have ADHD. Maybe I am OCD. And then they end up in your classroom self-identifying. How many of them actually had a diagnosis? And then you say, oh, would that legitimize it more if they actually had a doctor's diagnosis? Well, as soon as you go back to the doctor's office and we start talking about the PHQ-9 or the GAD-7 or these simple questionnaires, Will and I are like, what is it with those measures? And we read people's work like James Davies, who wrote a book a couple of years ago called Sedated. And then you start shining lights into corners, Will. And you go, oh, the PHQ-9 was designed by a pharmaceutical company funded that. The same one. The marketing team at was it Pfizer that was selling Zoloft at the time?
Zoloft, yeah.
So they needed a tool to be able to diagnose the different levels of prescription for anxiety and depression. So the pharmaceutical company itself created the tools that go into the doctor's hands. Not only is the bar lowered for entrance to the diagnosis, there's a corporate angle to it and a profit incentive. Now, we could have written 3 volumes of Kids These Days if Will would have let me show the backstories more on a lot of these things. Psychiatry for Kids, if you go look at the researchers, the lead young MD researchers that wrote that book, you can get back to see where the funding came from. You can see the foundations, you can see the organizations. And you know this to be true, that if we did this in any field, wilderness therapy, you can start to get back to see corporate influence. And then you can see venture capitalism, and then you can see the players that are profiting from these frontline practices that sometimes are in question. This is the case with everything in this book. When I interviewed Bruce Lanphier, I think Will was a little, I don't know if you were a little shocked, but definitely questioning, why are you interviewing an environmental toxins researcher from Simon Fraser University? He used to be in the States at, I think it was Children's Hospital Cincinnati.
He worked for the EPA.
He's worked for
California Attorney General's office.
He's been on the commissions and the review panels for toxins in the United States for a long time, but he's also been kicked off or uninvited from those panels when their reports come out, because he's been pointing at environmental toxins that should never have been allowed into the environment because they have negative human health effects. Now, when you start reading the descriptions of things like the PFAS, and I'm not going to get the names right on all the plastics, but mercury, lead, different fertilizers and herbicides that have different effects.
BPA, we're all outdoor people. We all had Nalgene's.
An Nalgene water bottle crisis.
We all had Patagonia jackets that had PFAS. I got a pile over here that I think I'm sending it back.
So, Will, here's the important part for this book. When you start reading the health effects, you read neurological impacts, you read cancer, you read behavioral change. You start reading and listing the behavioral changes. You've got lowered IQs, you've got behavioral problems, you've got violence. Now, between Dr. Bruce Lanphier talking about environmental toxins and interviewing Gordon Neufeld and talking about his working career. So as a practitioner, he worked in and out of youth mental health, but also in corrections. So he and I were in corrections at the same time in the 1990s into, say, 2000. I said to him, I said, we noticed we lost a lot of violent offenders. Like they weren't, I said, oh, they were more internalizing. They went from being outwardly behavioral, auto theft, break and enter, violent assaults, like really rough behavioral stuff in the late 1990s. But then all of our youth coming into those wilderness programs suddenly were like depression, anxiety, and a different category of behaviors. And he said, oh, that had nothing to do with a change in the youth. That had to do with a change in the environment. And then Dr. Bruce Lanphier telling us about the toxins had said, 1985, Canada and the United States, both countries banned lead in paint and lead in fuel. There was a 10-year latency period. So violent crime actually peaked in 1995, the same year that Rudy Giuliani became mayor of New York City and said, I'm going to deal with violence. I'm going to deal with crime in the city. And there was a drop off. But then we found research that said it dropped off in small town Iowa at the same rates. So environmental toxins, how many of our youth that we're dealing with that we say have a diagnosed mental health disorder actually are just dealing with an environmental toxin in their home, in their community, in their school? Again, that's not a part of this conversation. We don't hear our other therapeutic communities having these conversations, but really, and Will harps on this a little bit, that chapter was not 5,000 words, but at one point, I think it was 10 to 15,000 words because there was so much.
It was fascinating. And it also showed, that chapter also showed, and I know I've spoken to you about this, Will. It showed how the corporate interest outweighed the harm to an individual. And that part was like, no company is, I'm going to say this, I believe this to be true. I don't think there's people out there that go, I will get richer by the more people that I poison. I also don't think there are programs out there that probably really think the more kids I harm, the richer I'll get with my organization. But you have to find where the middle ground is on this, that how did this keep happening? No difference than I already brought up prolonged grief disorder. It's something, and I'll make up the statistic here. The majority of funding that the people who worked on the newest revision of the DSM to include prolonged grief disorder, the majority of the funding was undisclosed. So how does a new disorder get included when the people who are involved in revising and editing this have no responsibility of saying who's funding them? What clinical trials did they participate in? Who paid for those clinical trials? That part, I think, was the most alarming to both Nevin and I. I think it's, and yes, writing about environmental toxins scared the shit out of me because I don't lose sleep about it, don't think about it. When people said BPA was bad, you need BPA Nalgene. Oh, nah, okay, whatever. But the data is there. It's really scary. And if we are going to label, pathologize, and subsequently medicate, again, introduce a new chemical into the developing body, but totally discount the chemicals from herbicides, pesticides. The end of those words, CIDE, means to kill. That's why we call it suicide. So if we're going to give people, make us all live around a world of all of these sides, and then to solve it, give them chemicals to intervene, we have to get really serious about how we think about this. I think it's a tragic tale of what has happened over the last 100 years.
And you also dig into the concept, I think it's chapter 3 with Dr. Mari Swingle, the concept of digital interference versus digital integration. So some people might be surprised to hear that you guys are not You like slow down on banning phones, which it actually from this conversation, it doesn't sound like you'd be going that. So tell us a little, dig into that a little bit, because that might surprise people who are listening to this interview right now.
Yeah. Think about the states, it may be certain states, and I know in Australia, they've definitely gone on this. In Canada, they're also heading down this path of bell-to-bell cell phone bans in schools. A lot of that action was triggered by Jonathan Haidt's book last year, The Anxious Generation. It created a movement. That movement was based on statistics. Most of those statistics came from Jean Twenge's research, which suggested that 25% of young people have a mental health disorder, and that there's strong correlations, which he lied and suggested that it's causal. There's strong correlations there with youth mental health rates. That's 25%. What is the rates of mental health disorders in adults? It's about 25%. So the numbers aren't necessarily different just because it's youth. The intervention is for 100% of youth. So you've got 75% of youth that do not have a mental health disorder that are actually being put under the exact same intervention. So this notion of a universalist intervention rarely works. There's too much nuance needed. There's context, there's culture, there's a whole bunch of other factors that are being missed. Kids with learning disabilities that have been functional because they've had a assistive device on their phone are now put in an awkward position where they either don't have the device or they have the device at the anger and fury of all the kids around them that aren't allowed their devices. So this interventionist model doesn't necessarily work. Digital integration versus digital interference. Dr. Mari Swingle is a neurotherapist. She works with brainwave mapping. She can see brainwave patterns of young kids or adults. And before she sees them as a client in the room as a therapist, she knows what's going on with their brain. She can detect and understand whether this is an issue of, say, gaming addiction versus, that's her realm. She gives great examples in her book, which is called iMinds, which unfortunately not enough people have read. It's a treatise on how to live a life with digital integration. One of the best examples was shooting player game, some type of video game that's super interactive and you're in it and you're shooting at people and people are shooting at you. A 21-year-old game developer who actually is playing that game to detect changes or necessary improvements can be fully regulated and think cognitively and rationally about what's working, what isn't working, how do I improve this. A 13-year-old playing that exact same game might be completely dysregulated and losing their mind. And then Will comes in and unplugs it because it's dinner time, and then they just absolutely lose their shit. Two completely different experiences. Is it the game or is it the developmental stage of the individual? So this idea that digital integration can happen, I teach at a university. We have 20 to 25-year-olds, 18 to 25-year-olds sitting in a classroom. Some of them are entrepreneurial. Some of them are doing things online that are actually like making them an income. Some of them are actually just, their lives are so integrated. And Will, you brought up this example in our book that during COVID, all these young people were told, you're going online, you'll be fine. You're a digital native. You're an expert at this already. On-screen learning, distance learning, digital. And now you can't have your phone because you're not responsible enough or it's bad for you. 180-degree turn. What changed?
And this is again not a funny haha, but in Australia, they've enacted November last year. They enacted that social media will be banned for all kids under 16 years old. And one of the interesting things, the age of criminal responsibility in Australia is 10. So you're old enough to know right from wrong from 10 years old, but not able to navigate social media. It's a cognitive dissonance, what we're setting up kids with. And Nevin brought up Jean Twenge's research. One of the other things, and we wrote about this in chapter 1, Jane Twenge did a longitudinal study. It's a great read. I don't remember the name of the study off the top of my head, but you can find it. She studied youth anxiety from the 1950s to the late 1980s. And so again, no smartphones, right? So we're just going to assume it's got to be something different that happened here. And from the 1950s, the level, I always butcher how I say this, but the level of anxiety of an inpatient psychiatric young client in the 1950s was the average level of anxiety of an everyday child in the 1980s. What happened? The Cold War happened. There were so many changes to the environment that social disconnection increased. So it was loneliness and environmental factors. And now look at today. Look at how we talk about politics. We're divided. We're as divided as ever, but it has to be the smartphone. No, come on. That story doesn't add up as well as what Twenge actually told us from the 1950s to the 1980s, that we are actually more disconnected and the environment is hurting us more and more.
As we kind of wind down this episode of Stories from the Field, what sort of adulting takeaways that you hope, like I've just learned a huge amount. I'm going to process it a lot more because we could talk about all the different aspects of your book. But
Oh, yes.
give us a few adulting recommendations or thoughts besides buying your book, which I highly recommend. So I'll put that out there.
Yep, may it start, Nevin?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
I think we did our best to try not to write another outdoor therapy book. But of course, that's the lane that we work in, and that's the lane that we research. And so we did look at some things like earlier years, like early childhood development. And in talking to someone like Ellen Sandsier from Norway, she's the world's foremost outdoor risky play researcher. Just listening to her was, I don't know what the word would be, it reaffirming for the work that we're doing, that we're not just in therapy, that we're in outdoor therapies, and that there's more to it. There's better health outcomes, quality of life. It's building a recreational lifestyle. And again, of course, we can't claim that our therapy is any better than anyone else's because we know that's not true. But just getting adults excited about allowing their kids to have more outdoor free time, unstructured play, unsupervised play, risky play, rough and tumble play, those simple elements. And I know that's also how Jonathan Haidt's wrapped up the anxious generation, that he's brought Lenore Skenazy's work in because they're friends, and brought the outdoor play piece back into it. That's so important because kids don't have the autonomy that they used to. And a study that we wrote up was also, it showed up in Alex Hutchinson's new book, The Explorer's Gene. He also looked at the same body of research, which is called ranging. This notion that in multi-generational homes in Europe, you could do a study where you could talk to the grandparents and say, Will White, when you were 9 years of age, how far were you allowed to range or roam from home without adult supervision?
Everywhere.
Everywhere. You take that same family and then you talk to Will's kids and you say, when you were 9 years old, how far did Will let you roam? And then the range is smaller. And then the existing current parent in the house, their kids aren't even going past the backyard. It's fenced in and it's an organized play date. So there's things like that where adults can think about small changes. Like, we're not telling people again how to parent or how to live their lives, but there's lots of things in this book where there's small takeaways. Don't change much, but change a little bit in many areas. That's how wicked problems are solved. This idea that one thing can be pinpointed and it's like, that's the cause of it. So we have to ban cell phones, or we have to get kids away from therapy. Like, it's too reactionary and too sensationalist. If we really want to make change, it's got to be a lot of people involved making a lot of small changes. If we're going into the schools, some teachers might struggle with some of the content in this book. Some teachers might get a little pushback on some of the ideas. The notion that we let kids have their big feelings in the classroom, well, that's just going to be disruptive. What if you sit with that child, they have their big feelings, they co-regulate with you instead of sending them out of the classroom? Not only does that individual child have a growth experience, the other 29 kids witness that. And they see that this is a safe enough place for me to have big feelings too. The teacher's going to be the adult in the room. Those are small changes. I don't know whether teachers are going to pick that up and go, oh, I should do more of this in my classroom. But we've just littered the book with ideas and chose not to pull out 3 and say, these are the 3 things, the 3 rules of adulting. Because that's too simplistic relative to this issue that is too grand and too nuanced. So small changes are important. Little victories, I like to call them with my clients. Little victories.
Will, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to add to, being that this podcast started on a wilderness therapy topic and our love of the outdoors, is the reason so many of us go outside and want to bring the people that we get to work with outside is because there's some sort of possibility there. Now, what ends up happening is we think, I better control how this other person experiences the outdoors. And I think kids these days is innately a experiential book. I think it's about what are kids experiencing, and then what are adults inherently trying to stop kids from experiencing. And I think the biggest thing is, for us who work in the outdoors, who go on hikes with people, who go on long extended wilderness expeditions with people, instead of thinking, how do I control what my client is experiencing? Think about, what is my client experiencing? And just go from there. That if we can have really open conversations with the people that we work with about what they're going through, we will end up knowing more about what kids are thinking about the world, what they're experiencing, and it will end up leading us away from this kids these days effect. I think there's so much about this that outdoor experiential educators already get, which is you could do an activity called a trust fall. That does not mean anyone has learned trust. You have to figure out what they took away from reflecting on the experience. I also think going back to the John Dewey literature is incredible. And I think that was so much about preserving democracy by making the best classroom in the world mimic the best democracy, which is everybody has an opinion, everybody has a voice, everybody can participate. So when I read the literature about kids don't have sex anymore, they don't do drugs anymore, they don't drink beer anymore, the first thing I thought is, it's because they're not participating. I think if we go back to creating a world where kids can participate, it means that they can feel safe enough to tell us what they participated in. And I think that if we're working in residential care, really worry about what kids are saying that they participate in and believe them. Say, I think it stinks, and go, how can we change it? Because as Nevin said, all adults set up the world that kids live in. So I think give them the world to participate in.
Maybe if I can add one more thought on our conversation today, is that I would like to make sure that I continue to repeat the impact that Dr. Martin Brokenleg's work had on us. I'm saying us as, say, Canadian youth workers in the 1990s. And I'm not sure, Will, if you're familiar with the Reclaiming Youth at Risk book. It was a little green book. Martin
I think
Brokenleg,
it's in chapter 2 and
Yeah.
Starving.
Circle of Courage model.
Circle of Courage model, yeah.
Why don't you
So-
go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so it's an indigenously informed model for youth development or just life in general. But the way that it was written up and adopted in the youth work residential care settings in Canada in the 1990s, it became the go-to. It was the little green book. It was like a little Bible on how to build programs. And to be able to interview Martin, who's also now late in age and dealing with Parkinson's disease, and going to take him a copy of the book this coming week because he lives nearby. It got us thinking about this idea of first is belonging. We all have to feel that we're a part of something, that people care for us, that there's a community or a tribe. Mastery, the development of skills. Every child has to be good at something. The development of independence. And then generosity, which is the closing of the circle, because then it's giving back to the family community. And so in writing that chapter, we start thinking about tradition, old ways. And I know we mentioned the word conservative a couple times, but conservative as in conserving the old traditional ways that actually work. So more traditions around parenting, more traditions around community and family and how you engage children as meaningful contributors to the family's success. And then Kurt Hahn in the 1920s and 30s, right? The notion of crew as opposed to passenger. Kids have to feel, one, that they have voice and that they participate in democracy, but also that they're needed. That's where that sense of belonging comes from, and it gives them the safe environment to take risks. And some of these things, again, very simple, but rather than looking for the next expert and the next pill and the next innovation or the next intervention, maybe sometimes we just have to look back and say what worked. And Will brought Positive Deviance to wrap the book up, which is looking at those successful individuals, communities, families in environments that maybe aren't working. Who's successful? What's going on? It may be someone who's doing something completely against the mainstream, but they might be the model to look to.
And can I say, I know we have to wrap up, but Will, you're going to love this. I can tell you, when Nevin sat down with Martin Brokenleg and recorded this conversation, Martin Brokenleg spent 15 minutes talking about Steve Przonka and Alaska crossings. And I just went, wait, I worked there. And then Bruce Lamphere, the environmental toxins researcher, spoke about working at he volunteers at his kids'. It's like
Summer
a
camps.
church, like summer camp or something. And he takes the kids camping. And I'm going, so the wilderness therapy sort of narrative weaved through every single conversation that we all had. And I remember sitting there, and I think Steve will like to hear this because I think I know that he follows your podcast, that Martin Brokenleg was like, there's a guy, he's very smart, very energetic with a big red beard, and he lives in Alaska, and he ran the best program I've ever seen for Indigenous youth in Alaska. And I was listening to it going, that's Steve that was my boss. Like, I was like,
It's a small world.
But so I think, like, we often get asked, how is what we did relevant to the outdoor therapy world? And I think the relevance is that we all want to be as useful as we can. And part of that is being informed by what anyone says is the best available evidence. And that's tricky. It's complicated. There's too much evidence to navigate. But at the same time, I think that many outdoor people working therapeutically in the outdoors, I think there's a lot that could be taken away from this, we hope.
I definitely agree. Your book is Kids These Days, available on Amazon and other booksellers. Nevin
Yeah.
Harper, Will Dobud, thank you so much for sharing your story once again, 3 times for you, Will, on Stories from the Field.
Thanks, Will. Good to see you.